Okay, so my name's Lawrence Dawkins Hall. My day job is as a life scientist technician at the University of Leicester, but I am actually here in my capacity as an applicant support mentor for the Science Council. Essentially what I'm going to be talking about is a problem that's quite current and has implications for both universities and the wider knowledge-based economy, and that's challenges faced in 21st century technicians. Those challenges being really sort of outlined here. But before I get going, given that I have the luxury of time, who here has actually heard of the Science Council and knows what its mission is, roughly? Well, that's really good. So when I say that I'm here in my capacity as an applicant support mentor, the Science Council, for those of you who don't know, are involved in moderating standards through a scheme called professional registration, amongst other things. And my role as a support mentor being the key word, is the fact that I'm an advocate for the Science Council and I travel all over and I actually work with technicians, mostly technicians, it doesn't have to be. Generally it's people without PhDs, but not always. But I work basically with scientists of all description who want to actually engage in professional registration under the aegis of the Science Council. What I'm going to say is essentially experiential, and by that I mean it's a personal journey. I will give some facts and figures, particularly at the start, to try and create context, and they're taken from something called the Technician Make It Happen, which is essentially the arm of Gatsby, a charitable foundation which is essentially bankrolled by Lord Sainsbury, amongst others, primarily him, that's responsible for this thing called the Technician Commitment. And it's the Technician Commitment which is a response to some of the extant challenges that I'm really going to be talking about. And I'm involved with, not just with the Science Council and the IST, but also my own institution, the University of Leicester. So enough about that. So essentially I set out my stall here. So really there are significant problems going forward if we consider that Britain is well placed to be at the vanguard of a knowledge-based technical economy. And technicians need to play a part in that. And I think people are just waking up to the fact now that technicians essentially are an underutilized resource based on their experiences and qualifications. And I'll talk about what that leads to in an academic setting in a minute. So essentially, if you were to try and sum up some of the sort of seminal imperatives, technicians are getting older, we're an aging cohort, retirement is outstripping recruitment, and there's lots of reasons for that. Jobs are being frozen as aging technicians who perhaps are more senior are retiring. There's a problem, a significant problem with temporary job contracts, and linked to all of the above, outmoded or ill-defined job descriptions. And really the Technician Commitment is one of a number of seminal initiatives that's designed to actually, I was going to say address, but redress some of these problems to actually ensure that technicians are recruited in the right sorts of numbers to play an active role going forward as a country, as an economy, in a knowledge-based economy. I mentioned the fact that the response that I'm going to talk about is something called the Technician Commitment, this initiative to actually redress some of these issues. And I was actually looking for a soundbite that essentially sums up what the ethos and remit of the Technician's Commitment is. And it's essentially this, that Richard Branson said that you should train people well enough so if they want to, they could leave, but you should treat them well enough that they actually don't want to. And that, in a nutshell, really sums up what the mission goal of the Technician Commitment is. So, if we start where essentially everything starts, the age-old, ubiquitous problem of funding. So the UK is committed to investing 2.4% of its GDP into research, specifically research and development, by 2027. And that equates to increasing the number of personnel in R&D by 200,000 in the same period. Of course, that's not just technicians, it's scientists and engineers of all descriptions, but the idea with the Technician Commitment in particular is that technicians will become an integral, vital and productive part of that mix, contributing in a significant way to basically the emerging knowledge-based economy. So let's start with age. Technicians are actually retiring at the rate of 50,000 a year, and that's sort of confounded by the fact, this attrition is confounded by the fact that young technicians are actually deserting ship in favour particularly of more secure prospects. So to try and personalise that, I've worked at various academic institutions for about 30 years, and the number of technicians I've seen that have become, say, science school teachers, they've just left because, you know, they're sort of, everything's fine in their 20s, but in their 30s, where they're thinking about settling down, you have to think about the existential problems in life, mortgages, etc. And so they look for more secure employment, and you can't blame them. Recruitment shortages are such that 700,000 more technicians, and that isn't just R&D as I've mentioned, hence the apparent disparity between the two numbers. 700,000 more technicians will need to be recruited in the next decade to sustain demand. And if I just put some specific figures on this, these figures are taken from Gatsby, but they're from 2009 to 10, but the situation hasn't changed, even if the numbers have. But suffice to say that these upper quartiles dominate the age range of the workforce. So, for example, in biological sciences, 43% of technicians are over 50, and in physics, it's over 50%. I use the metaphor of snakes and ladders, and I have personal experience of this, and that's the fact that essentially part of the problem with retaining technicians and rewarding them is the fact that a lot of technicians, and this is increasingly so, are on temporary contracts. Now, if you're lucky enough, as I was, say, in Manchester in the 90s, to actually stay within one place for 9 years, I worked my way up the system to a certain grade. But then, because of the vicissitudes of finance, bringing in grants, sometimes you get them, sometimes you don't, I was obliged to leave. When you leave, often it's not possible to find a job at the same grade. So it's almost like climbing a ladder, then falling down a snake. So I found myself in the early 2000s at 2 grades lower than I was when I started in Manchester. I'd worked up 2 grades in that 9 years. And it does vary from institution to institution in terms of academic universities, but generally it's recognised as a universal problem, particularly within the university setting. There's also a problem of perception. I think technicians themselves know what they do, but a lot of people in wider society don't. And I think crucially, where the working conditions of technicians are concerned, a lot of the senior staff that are actually their paymasters don't. So I'm sure that when I say that professors in universities often think that technicians essentially are generic bottle washers, any of you that work in life sciences labs, for example, I can't speak for engineering, I'm sure that resonates with you, that they don't actually always appreciate what we do because they're so far removed from the lab, and the focus is always on, in academic settings, people with PhDs. And so our skills tend to get overlooked. Nonetheless, in reality, technicians actually have a plethora of roles. This is actually a general sort of cartoon. It talks about technician scientists, teacher scientists, but in fact, you could substitute the word technician for scientist in a lot of those actually, and technicians in universities are fulfilling all of those roles and more. And sort of commensurate with the fact that they're doing a series of up to 400 job titles, commensurate with the fact that they have these very specialised, highly skilled roles. Many of them are very educated. In a study that was conducted by the BBSRC, 51% had doctorates. And many actually are involved not just actively in research, but also in teaching, training and supervising of students and other technicians. So they're anything but bottle washers, as the last slide might imply. Nevertheless, it's something of a paradoxical picture because there's a rather disturbing trend, based on my own experience, of technicians who were hitherto being used in quite skillful roles, changing jobs, and actually finding that they spend more and more of their time doing routine things. So I've entitled this slide, "What's in a Name?" And at my own institution at the moment, for example, there seems to be this increasing dichotomy between a technician who really is essentially a bin man. This is a study that was done by Kelly Veer that describes technicians in that regard as the Cinderellas of science, and actually research assistants. It does vary from institution to institution. I'm at Leicester at the moment, and the technician commitment plan is something where you have to address these issues. And in fact, this is something that's in the current Leicester University plan, that essentially it's almost like the term technician at Leicester is becoming pejorative. And by implication, if you carry out active research, then you are a research assistant. But it is a very variegated picture, and I have experience of Manchester, for example, and Edinburgh, where that's very much not the case. As many of you are aware, technicians are vital scientists, and really as a background to a lot of these initiatives, including technician commitment, there have been a series of studies that have been commissioned that sort of extol the fact that innovation is not the exclusive preserve of highly educated scientists, and by scientists that usually refers to someone with a PhD in engineers. We need to recognise the fact that technicians are skilled workers, as already sort of alluded to, and I'm sure many of you in this audience know, and basically those skills need to be harnessed to essentially ensure that Britain stays at the vanguard of a knowledge-based economy. And so this is just a series of reports that I've highlighted in this slide, but there have been many actually commissioned by the Gatsby Foundation, which funds the technician commitment that the Science Council actually moderates. And this is really more of the same. So based on the sort of current technician crisis, what is to be done? Well, one thing is raising the profile of technicians. The other is forging a clearer technical path. And this is actually a study that was published in Nature by somebody called Kelly Veer, who is the lead for the Science Council on the technician commitment. So essentially, she's the principal person. And so all of this collectively culminates in this thing called the technician commitment. The technician commitment, to reiterate, is something that is essentially moderated and overseen by the Science Council, who I'm talking for today. It's funded by Gatsby, and if you are to break it down into what you might call imperatives or priority areas, there are 4 key pillars: visibility, recognition, career development, and sustainability. Visibility really is making sure that the skills of technicians are recognised, not just within an institution, but outside an institution. And there are various things that you can do to ensure that that happens, such as essentially promotional days where you focus on the work of technicians. Recognition essentially is the thing that both within my own university, but also working for the IST, that's a licensed body of the Science Council, and the Science Council itself, that I'm involved in. So one way of having your skills recognised or validated is through this scheme called professional registration that I'm going to elaborate on towards the end of the talk. It's also fair to say that traditionally recognition was getting your name on a paper if you've contributed to a publication. And that's something I think that used to happen in the 80s and 90s, but for various reasons has stopped happening. So now there's essentially a drive via the technician commitment to essentially turn back the clock in that regard. So it's about principally recognising technicians through publications, but in addition, this new thing, professional registration, that I'm involved in and I'll elaborate on in a second. I mentioned the fact that the Gatsby sort of underwrites this and the Science Council controls this, but given that this is a national initiative, it's actually supported by a number of organisations, other research councils, Research England, other councils, Engineering Council, Vitae is an organisation that works with universities and engineering councils to try and promote the well-being and career structure for technicians. And you can see that there are some well-known names there, such as the MRC and the Wellcome Trust. So there's some big hitters that are behind this, and hopefully that will mean that this will actually have teeth. I should point out as well that in universities that sign the technician commitment, in other words, they make their commitment to the commitment, it tends to be subsumed within the wider remit of equality and diversity. And I've pointed out a couple of here, which is making sure technicians via the commitment reach their potential, and also addressing the negative consequences of short-term contracts, which I think is a big issue in universities in particular. I'll talk primarily about recognition, but I thought I'd just highlight visibility, which is one pillar of the technician commitment. So there's a lot of online material. This is a technician commitment Twitter account. That's Denise McLean from Nottingham, who's done an awful lot for her own institution and nationally to promote technicians. This is actually me talking at basically the launch event of our own sort of commitment initiative that I'll come back to in a second, and the fact that there is a lot of publication online, including this myself on the IST website. And this is something actually I attended on behalf of the IST about 2 weeks ago. This was a technician showcase at Queen's University in Belfast, where what they did was they had a big sort of fanfare, a big launch event where they brought in academics, companies, and they got the technicians to actually talk about their work and showcase their work through posters. So this really is synonymous with the recognition and visibility pillars of the technician commitment. This is just really more of the same. Given that I work at the University of Leicester, I thought I'd take the opportunity to talk about the fact that most universities have their own intranet sites where technicians can sort of air their grievances and talk about different schemes. This is the one at Leicester. This is me advertising this talk. And also, when universities commit to the commitment, and I'll come back to this in a second, there essentially is a plan that's made public. So it has to be on their own website. This is part of the visibility ethos. It's also deposited as part of the resources of Technicians Make It Happen, as part of the sort of Gatsby materials. So, universities can go down the road, if you like, of committing to the commitment. And what does that mean? Well, essentially, it involves a day where somebody very high up, which is important, signs the commitment. Then really following on from that commitment to the commitment through a high-level signature, there is actually a plan of action that they're expected to essentially conceive and implement. And what it is, it's a 5-action plan, hence the 5 contextual questions. And what they refer to are the 4 aforementioned pillars, but also impact. Okay, this is how you're going to implement the 4 pillars in terms of detail, but what can you do to actually demonstrate that you're actually fulfilling your commitment to the commitment? So essentially what happens is they come up with a plan, which is for 2 years. They're given, I think, a year from signing to actually create this plan and make it public. 1 year into that 2-year plan, there's essentially a stock take where the steering group looks at progress. You know, what are you doing to actually can you demonstrate to us that you're actually fulfilling your pledge and it's not simply platitudes on paper? And all of these plans are actually deposited into ALIA, as I've just said, on the Gatsby website. So this is the University of Leicester's plan. So if you look at the university plan, this is a summary of the plan. The detailed plan is there. This really is representative of the sorts of things in terms of a summary that you would expect in a plan, and the detailed plan is obviously how they're going to implement it. So for examples, as I've said, recognition and visibility, that relates to point 2, making sure that technicians, if they contribute in a substantial way to a publication, they get their name as a co-author. That increasingly is not happening and hitherto used to. Making sure there's a defined career path for technical staff. Encourage job shadowing and secondment opportunities, both within Leicester and also through something called Midlands Innovation, for example, in this area, for other universities in the Midlands that have signed up to Midlands Innovation. And I should say in passing that at the moment, when I'm not here, I'm actually on a secondment at Leicester University to try and actually pick up master's teaching skills. And this is something fairly new, and it's in the wake of the fact that they've signed this commitment. Nope. So normally when you have a plan, there's normally a big fanfare and a launch. That's me essentially talking about the technician's commitment. And the idea with the launch is, apart from making technicians visible, it's an opportunity for technicians to actually get together with senior members of staff who actually have determined their fate and talk about some of the things that they would like to actually see as part of the plan. So this really precedes the plan and gives people that write the plan, if you like, material to think about. So this is really sort of technicians having a voice, and hopefully some of their seminal points finding their way into that 10-point action plan, or should I say the details of that action plan. So I've mentioned the technician commitment in general, both within my own institution and also working as a support mentor for the Science Council and having a similar role with one of their licensed bodies, the Institute of Science and Technology, the IST. I'm specifically involved with the recognition pillar. And by that I mean I support professional registration within my own institution and nationally through the auspices of the Science Council and the IST. Okay, so professional registration is, to use a platitude, it's giving technicians the status they deserve, and it's essentially controlled by the Science Council for lots of different disciplines, but also the Engineering Council and the Chartered Institute for IT can also award professional registration. So what is professional registration? Well, professional registration with the Science Council provides an independent recognition of your achievements. It's not a qualification, it's not a PhD or a master's by dissertation. It's essentially getting you to reflect upon, and I haven't got time to go into details, different things that you've done and generating something like a 5,000 word report. And essentially what you talk about is experiences you've had over the last 3 to 5 years that fulfill certain competencies. Some of those are technical, scientific, others are about professional conduct, communication skills, maybe financial skills. So it basically addresses different aspects of your job role and essentially validates those skills. It's much therefore like the award that the engineering give, Chartered Engineering Award. And as really to reiterate, historically there's been an absence of formal recognition other than names on papers, which is diminishing simply because within a university environment, which I'm talking about, essentially your meal ticket, generally speaking, is a PhD. And without a PhD, you're often forgotten. There are 3 registers within a university relating to your degree of experience in terms of those competencies, and usually in association with that, your seniority in a role and also your qualifications. There's one more that relates to teachers in secondary schools, but that's not something as a technician that obviously I'm involved in. So in essence, RSci Tech is somebody that is usually got about 2 years experience and are pretty good. They're coming in with anything from an HND typically to a BSc within the university. RSci, a little bit more experience, they can work independently, maybe 3 or 4 years experience, so working to a higher level in terms of those competencies that I outlined. Seaside generally, but not always, tend to be in more senior roles. So they're either managers, or if not, they manage people as I do, and they tend to have extra responsibilities such as equipment budgets, consumable budgets, etc. So the benefits of registration. The thing about the competencies is when you fill them out, you reflect in detail on your CPD. So as a minimum, it's a tool for actually thinking about what you've done and where you'd like to go. And we tend to all have annual appraisals now. And so it's actually a good way of completing your annual appraisal. Validation of skills, as I've said. Outside prospects. I'm here by virtue of the fact that I'm something called a chartered scientist, and so I got this role as a mentor with the Science Support Council, Science Council. External job prospects. There are a number of institutions now at the vanguard of this movement that have a critical mass of registered technicians, and therefore, and this is really the aspiration, technicians that have professional registration will be favoured potentially in terms of promotion over those that don't. And in fact, and all such consequences exemplify the technician commitment. And in fact, I won't say who this is, but in some universities now, and particularly government institutes, actually a willingness to work towards or having some level of professional registration is a prerequisite for actually applying for the job. If you don't have that in some of these institutes already who are further down the road of making, basically translating registration into real impact, it's actually hard to even get through the door for an interview. I'll skip that. So support with registration, I'm nearly done. The Science Council has something called the Employer Champion Scheme, and this is where, basically working with the Science Council, candidates in an institute can collectively apply for professional registration. And one thing the Science Council can offer, and this is where I come in, is you can actually provide a mentor to go and work with those candidates. And at the moment, there are 3 of us in that role. And I'll conclude, because I'm quite a bit over time, by saying that this is clearly the future, to actually have as many candidates as you can going through professional registration, ideally therefore going through in block. And this is a current list of the different institutions, university and otherwise, that are current employer champions. And I'm going to end by just putting up a table that the Royal Society of Biology has on their website, which shows something about the different registers, commensurate skills and education, and the sorts of costs involved. And I'll end by saying that the one thing maybe I missed out is that many universities that commit to the commitment, and in particular those that go down the employer champion route, they tend to underwrite at least the first year of registration costs. Thank you. Questions? I know we're a bit over time. Do you know something? I don't know. I know about these first 3. Jane, do you know what that is? What is UKRT? I tend to deal with these first 3 columns. It's not, so let's put it this way, as someone working in a university, it's not something that, at least as a life science technician, that really pertains. If you're working in a university and you're a life science technician, it's really these 3 registers here that you will be thinking about applying for. Hi.
I was just wondering, if your university has signed up to the commitment,
Yes.
which mine has, yet still don't seem to be fulfilling it, is there any way of pursuing them through the Science Council, through the IST?
I don't know, Jane. So Jane is a manager at the Science Council.
So,
Yes.
I mean, your first port of call is with whoever is the lead. So the technician commitment will have been signed, as Lawrence mentioned, at the highest, at the provost level, and then delegated. So I would encourage you first off to go to the lead, because they will have created a steering committee within your university. But equally, there is a steering board at the technician commitment level who are very interested to hear what's working and what's not working, so that we can actually take a look at where people are fulfilling what they've said they're going to and where it's not into the ground.
Can I ask, actually, and this sort of complements what Jane's saying, do you have, so for example, recently Leicester had a sort of follow-up to their commitment launch where technicians, we signed it about 2 years ago, so about 2 months ago we had a meeting and we just got technicians to talk about what they thought was going on and if essentially the plan was in their eyes being fulfilled, being substantiated. Do you have those sorts of public forums where technicians get together with the managers, including the steering group and the person who signed, so that they can talk one-on-one?
Not that I'm aware of. We have something called TechNet.
Yes.
Sheffield,
Yeah.
that we set up just for technicians to meet and discuss these kinds of issues. But as far as I'm aware, the management doesn't descend upon us. We're going through this. We've just got a new vice chancellor. It's been in about a year, and he's done a consultation of all researchers. And in this consultative document,
Technicians weren't mentioned once,
Yeah.
and all researchers were in it. They mentioned ECRs, they mentioned academics, they mentioned chairs, but not technicians.
I'm going to be honest with you, as somebody that has worked in this a while in different institutes, I think even for, when I think of my own experiences, I think of certain institutes like Manchester and Edinburgh that have signed the commitment versus others that I won't name that have also signed, and there's significant differences in how they operate, and I know that from experience. And one of the differences between those institutes is whether you've got people at the top that actually believe in it. So, for example, Nottingham is a very good example, or Sheffield, where the vice chancellors are pushing this personally, and Sheffield, yes.
I'm at
You're at Sheffield. Ah, okay. Well, that just invalidates what I've just said, doesn't it? Okay. Well, that's interesting. Have you spoken to Terry Croft?
no, and Kevin's left as well. He's
Yes.
left the whole, so
Okay, that surprises me because I always thought Sheffield were, because of the IST, because of people like Terry Croft, and your old VC who's left,
yeah,
was it different under him?
yeah.
We've run out of time. Okay.
The whole tech, yeah.
Brian. Hello. Nice to see you.
I stood there for